$1 silver. That's all it took to buy a human being in 1882 Colorado. But this wasn't about buying, it was about saving. When Ruth Anne Stoultz stood half naked on that auction block, her flesh exposed to jeering men who called her the fat Amish girl, nobody wanted her. Nobody except the mountain man with dead eyes and a scarred face who silenced an entire town with 2 words, "She's mine." Before we begin, subscribe and follow this story to the end. Comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The rope burned. Ruth Ann felt it cutting Shawl into her wrists before she understood where she was. Cold air slapped her bare shoulders. Her chemise, torn at the neck, did nothing against the October wind ripping through Timber Ridge's town square. She tried pulling the fabric together. Her hands wouldn't move. Bound behind her back. "Step up, old girl. Let 'em see what they're bitten on." Uncle Matthias's breath stank of whiskey, his hand shoved between her shoulder blades. Ruth Ann stumbled forward onto the wooden platform, bare feet scraping splinters. The crowd roared. "Look at the size of her Amish cow. Nobody's gonna want that." Ruth Ann squeezed her eyes shut. 3 days ago, she'd been hanging laundry with Mama in Pennsylvania. 3 days ago, Uncle Matthias had shown up with a telegram, both parents dead in a barn fire. 3 days ago, family had meant safety. "Gentlemen," Matthias bellowed, "I present my niece, Ruth Anne Stoultz. Strong as an ox, works like a mule. Perfect for any man needing extra hands on his claim. Or extra pounds in his bed." The laughter got meaner. Ruth Ann's face burned. 18 years old. Bigger than most men in this crowd. Her body had always been her shame back home, too large, too clumsy, too much. But this displayed like livestock. "Lord Jesus," she whispered in German. "If you're there, what's she saying? Probably praying for someone desperate enough." More laughter. Always laughter. Matthias grabbed her arm and spun her. "Show 'em your teeth, girl. Show 'em you're healthy." Ruth Ann clenched her jaw. She could smell the desperation on him now, mixed with the whiskey. He'd been drinking since Pennsylvania. Drinking and muttering about debts and railroad men and how she was going to fix everything. "I said smile." His palm cracked across her face. The crowd went silent for 3 seconds. Then someone whistled low and appreciative. Ruth Ann tasted copper. Her cheek throbbed, but she didn't cry. Crying was surrender. "Who'll start the bidding?" Matthias's voice cracked. $20, 15. Silence. Ruth Ann opened her eyes. 40 men, maybe. A few women lurking near the storefronts. She knew this type from back home. Miners, ranchers, drifters, men who saw women as wives or whores with nothing in between. $10. Matthias was begging now. "She's worth $10. Look at those hips built for bearing children. And she cooks, sews, God-fearing and obedient. Don't look too obedient with that fat lip you just gave her." Some chuckled. Most just stared, calculating. How much work? How much humiliation? What was she worth? Nothing, apparently. $5. Matthias's voice broke. $5 for a healthy young woman? That's less than a decent horse. Horse would be more useful. The sheriff leaned against the general store badge, catching the gray light. Smiling. Not stopping this. Ruth Ann's legs started shaking. She'd heard stories about women in mining camps. What happened to girls with no protection? $1, Matthias screamed. $1 goddamn dollar and she's yours. The crowd shifted. Even by frontier standards, this was too much. That's when Ruth Ann heard them. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate. The crowd parted. The man who emerged was a mountain, 6.5 feet of muscle wrapped in buckskin and fur. His face looked like someone had taken a knife to it and carved deliberately, one cheek puckered white, the other scarred from temple to jaw. Black hair past his shoulders, thick beard. But his eyes stopped her breath. Empty, like looking into a frozen lake and seeing nothing underneath. He walked straight to the platform. Didn't look at anyone. His hand disappeared into his coat and came out with a single silver dollar. He set it on the platform's edge with a metallic clink that echoed louder than the earlier jeering. "She's paid for," barely a whisper. Everyone heard it. Matthias snatched the coin bit it grinned. "Sold to the mountain, man." "Wait," Ruth Ann started. The man moved fast, vaulted onto the platform, pulled a knife, cut her ropes in one motion. Then he shrugged out of his fur coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It smelled like pine smoke and something wild and clean underneath. "Arms through." Ruth Ann's hands shook too hard. He helped her movements gentle despite hands the size of dinner plates. "Can you walk?" She nodded. "Then walk." He stepped down and held out his hand. Ruth Ann stared at it. Scarred fingers, calloused palm, stained with gun oil, but open, patient. She took it. The crowd exploded. "Caleb, what the hell? That's a white woman, Brant. You can't just, she's no one's property." Still quiet. Something in his voice made the crowd step back. "Not mine, not his." He jerked his head toward Matthias. "She's a human being, and I'm taking her out of here before you animals forget what that means." The sheriff pushed off his post. "Now hold on, Caleb. You held on long enough, Tom. Held on while a drunk sold his niece like cattle. Held on while grown men mocked a terrified girl. You done holding on?" The sheriff's face went red, but he didn't move. Caleb led Ruth Ann down the steps. Her bare feet hit frozen mud. She gasped. He glanced down, saw she had no shoes, and without a word swept her into his arms. "I can walk." "Not in this mud." He carried her through the crowd like she weighed nothing. Ruth Ann pressed her face to his chest, blocking out the jeering faces, the pointing fingers, the women turning away in disgust. "Caleb Brant's got himself a fat bride. Better than nothing when you're alone on that mountain. Probably can't tell the difference in the dark anyway." Caleb's breathing stayed steady. His pace didn't change. He just walked boots, crunching frost until they reached the edge of town where a massive black horse stood tethered. He set Ruth Ann down, then pulled something from his saddlebag. Moccasins. Soft leather lined with rabbit fur. "They were my wife's." He knelt in the mud. "She's gone. You wear them." Ruth Ann's throat closed. "I can't. You're wearing them, or I'm carrying you 3 hours. Your choice." She let him put them on. Slightly too small, but better than bleeding feet. When he stood, he wouldn't meet her eyes. "I live 3 hours into the mountains. Cabin's rough but warm. You'll have your own space. I don't." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I didn't buy you for that. For anything. I just couldn't watch anymore." "Why?" He looked at her then, really looked. For a second something flickered in those dead eyes. "Because I know what it's like to be the thing nobody wants." He lifted her onto the horse swung up behind her. His arms came around to grip the reins, caging her in warmth. "Hold on." The horse surged forward. Behind them, Timber Ridge disappeared into gray afternoon. Ahead, mountains rose like broken teeth peaks, already white with early snow. Ruth Anne started shaking, not from cold. From the realization she'd escaped one nightmare only to ride into the unknown with a silent, scarred stranger who'd bought her for the price of a meal. Dome. They climbed in silence. Ruth Anne tried making herself smaller in the saddle, but the horse's movement kept throwing her poke against his chest. Eventually, she gave up and leaned into the warmth. He smelled like wood smoke and leather, nothing like the sour whiskey of Uncle Matthias, nothing like her father's church cologne. "What's your name?" she finally asked. "Caleb Brandt. I'm Ruth Anne Stoultz. I know, your uncle shouted it enough times." More silence. Ruth Anne watched the landscape change. Scrub pine to towering ponderosa, frost-hard grass to snow patches. The air thinned. If not for his coat and body heat, she'd have frozen. "Why did you really do it?" The question came out small. "Save me." His chest rose against her back. Long silence. She thought he wouldn't answer. "My wife was Shoshone." His voice stayed flat. 14 years ago, white men raided her village, killed the warriors, took women and children to sell. She was 12. A trapper named Mackenzie bought her for $2 and a bottle of whiskey. Ruth Ann's breath caught. He beat her, used her. When she tried running, he tied her outside his cabin like a dog. 3 years. Pause. I found her hunting elk, cut her free, killed Mackenzie when he came after us. You killed him. Shot him in the gut, watched him die, took 3 days. The casual way he said it made her skin crawl, but she didn't pull away. She never forgave me. Caleb's arms tightened slightly on the reins. Said I'd damned my soul for revenge. Said I'd become the same animal that hurt her. She was right, but she married me anyway. Tried to save me. Tried teaching me her language, her prayers, her ways. 8 years she tried. What happened? Winter fever, 3 years back. She died holding her medicine bag, asking the spirits to forgive me. Pause. I haven't spoken to God since. Haven't spoken much to anyone. Ruth Anne said nothing. What could she say? They climbed higher. Sun setting, now painting the snow orange and gold, beautiful and terrible. I won't hurt you, Caleb said suddenly. I need you knowing that. I don't want anything. When spring comes, if you want leaving, I'll take you to Denver, give you train money east. Why wait till spring? Because winter up here kills you in an hour if you don't know what you're doing, he paused, and because I'm tired of living in a tomb. The cabin appeared as the last light died, small, built into a rocky outcrop with a sod roof and one window. Smoke rose from a stone chimney. A lean-to stable stood to one side. Beyond that, a smokehouse and garden plot buried in snow. Caleb, dismounted, lifted her down. Her legs nearly buckled. You're exhausted. Not a question. Ruth Anne nodded. Haven't eaten since yesterday, or slept. Uncle Matthias kept me tied at night. Something dangerous flickered across Caleb's face. He's lucky I only took his dollar. I wanted his teeth. He led the horse away. Go on inside. I'll be right in. Ruth Anne pushed open the door and stopped. Spotless. Fire in the stone hearth. Table and 2 chairs by the window. Large bed in the corner covered in bear furs. Shelves with canned goods, dried herbs, leather-bound books. Cast-iron stove. Basin and pitcher. But the details stopped her breath. Dried flowers hanging from rafters, lavender and sage. A colorful woven blanket over the rocking chair. On the mantel, a small beaded leather pouch. His wife's things, still here, still present. This wasn't a cabin, it was a shrine. Ruth Anne stood in the center, this massive coat hanging off her and something cracked in her chest. Safe. For the first time in 3 days, she was safe. When Caleb came in, he found her in the rocking chair, sobbing into her hands. He stood in the doorway, snow melting off his shoulders. Then he moved to the stove and built a fire. Said nothing until it crackled. "There's elk stew from yesterday, and bread, when you're ready." Ruth Ann wiped her face. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "Crying. Being weak. You stood on that platform with tied hands and a bleeding face, and you didn't break." He looked at her. Something in his expression had shifted. "You're not weak, Ruth Anne Stoultz. You're just safe enough now to feel what happened." He ladled stew into a wooden bowl, brought it with bread. Simple meat, potatoes, carrots. The most delicious thing Ruth Ann had ever tasted. She ate 3 bowls while Caleb watched the fire. "The bed's yours," he said when she finished. "I'll sleep in the lean-to with Shadow." "No." Ruth Ann stood. "This is your home. I won't take your bed. You'll take it, or I'll sleep in the snow. Your choice." "Why are you being so kind?" He looked at her. For a second, she saw past the scars and empty eyes to the broken man underneath. Someone grieving. Someone who'd been alone 3 years with nothing but ghosts. "Because someone was kind to me once," he said quietly, "and I never got to thank her before she died." Ruth Ann dreamed of the auction block. But in the dream, no one came. She stood there, forever naked and bleeding, while the crowd laughed and their faces stretched into masks and their laughter became screaming. She woke, gasping. Dark, except for dying fire. Wind howling outside, rattling shutters. For a moment, she forgot where she was, then remembered. The mountain. Caleb. Safety. She sat up, pulling the bear fur around her shoulders. Her body ached from everything, the ride, the cold 3 days of hell. The door opened. Caleb came in, covered in snow, carrying firewood. He moved quietly to the hearth, started building up the fire. In the growing light, Ruth Ann saw him shivering. "You're freezing." He startled, hadn't known she was awake. "Storm came up. Had to secure the animals." "You can't sleep out there in this." "I'll be fine." "No." Ruth Ann stood wrapping the fur around herself. "You'll freeze, and then where will I be alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere with winter coming?" He looked at her, water dripping from his beard. "I'll sleep in the chair, by the fire. That chair will break your back. Then the floor." They stared at each other. Ruth Ann saw the exhaustion in his face, the way his hands shook as he added wood. "The bed's big enough." She heard herself say it. "If we put furs between us. If you stay on your side." "Ruth Ann, I'm not afraid of you, Caleb Brandt." She lifted her chin. "If you were going to hurt me, you'd have done it. And I'm not stupid enough to let a good man freeze because of propriety. We're not in Pennsylvania anymore." Something that might have been a smile tugged at his scarred cheek. "No, we're not." She rebuilt the bed while he changed in the corner, back turned. 3 layers of fur down the middle, creating a wall. Ruth Ann took the side near the actual wall. Caleb took the side near the door. They lay in darkness. Storm howling outside. "Thank you," Ruth Ann whispered. "For what?" "For being the kind of man who couldn't watch any more." Caleb didn't answer. But in the darkness, Ruth Ann thought she heard him whisper something. Might have been, "You're welcome." Might have been, "I'm sorry." Or it might have been a prayer. She fell asleep to his breathing and the crackling fire. For the first time since her parents died, she felt something other than terror. Hope. Basha. Something woke Ruth Ann before dawn. Not a sound. The absence of one. The storm had stopped. She opened her eyes to unexpected sunlight streaming through the window. Caleb's side of the bed was already cold, the furs pulled back neatly. Ruth Ann sat up slowly. Everything hurt. 3 days of hell had left marks. The door opened and Caleb backed in carrying a bucket of melted snow. He set it near the stove, then noticed she was awake. Coffee's hot, and oatmeal. Wasn't sure what you'd want. Ruth Ann pushed back the furs and stood smoothing down the borrowed nightshirt, one of Caleb's, that came to her knees. I want to help. Help with what? Whatever you do. She met his eyes. I'm not sitting idle while you work. He studied her. You're hurt. You need rest. I'm Amish. Ruth Ann's voice came out firm. We don't rest when there's work. Now give me something useful before I go insane. The corner of his mouth twitched. All right, but first eat. And they sat across from each other, eating oatmeal with honey and dried berries. Ruth Ann tried not staring, but Caleb's face in the morning light showed even more scars. Someone had cut him deep, deliberately. You can ask, he said, without looking up. Ask what? About the scars. Everyone does. Ruth Ann set down her spoon. I was going to ask if you have a Bible. He blinked. What, a Bible? Or scripture? I haven't prayed properly in days and it's making me feel untethered. Caleb stood, went to a trunk in the corner, came back with a leather-bound book. My wife's Bible, Shona on one side, English on the other. Missionary gave it to her. Ruth Ann opened it carefully. Pages, worn, marked with notes in feminine handwriting. On the flyleaf, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Psalm 24:1. She loved that verse, Caleb said quietly. Said it meant no man could truly own the land, or each other. She was wise. She was patient with a fool. Comfortable silence while Ruth Ann read. After a bit, Caleb started explaining the day, checking trap lines, cutting wood, tending animals. Ruth Ann listened, then stood and began clearing dishes. Where's your water source? Spring about 50 yards north, but it's freezing. Then I'll dress warm. She washed dishes and melted snow while Caleb watched bemused. Then she swept. Organized food stores, inventoried supplies. Her Amish training took over. Within 2 hours the cabin was cleaner than it had been in years. You don't have to do all this, Caleb said. Yes, I do. Ruth Ann straightened, pushing hair from her face. You saved my life. Least I can do is make your home livable. It was livable. It was existing. There's a difference. Something shifted in his expression. My wife used to say that exact thing. Caleb, we're not surviving. We're living. Then she and I would have gotten along. Yeah, his voice went soft. You would have. He picked up his rifle. I'm checking traps. You'll be all right alone. Ruth Ann looked around the warm cabin. Food, water, safety. I'll be fine. After he left, she found cleaning supplies and really got to work. Scrubbed floors, washed windows, dusted shelves. In the trunk where Caleb found the Bible, she discovered more of his wife's things. Beautiful beadwork, soft leather clothing, bundles of dried herbs. Ruth Anne ran her fingers over a particularly lovely dress, feeling the craftsmanship. This woman had been skilled, patient, creative, and she had loved Caleb enough to try saving his soul. "Hope I can do half as good," Ruth Anne whispered to the empty room. She was rehanging herbs when she heard horses. Her heart stopped. Not Caleb. He'd gone on foot. Ruth Anne moved to the window. 3 men on horseback approaching. Expensive coats, rifles, not trappers or miners. These men had money. The lead rider was maybe 50. Silver hair, neat beard. He dismounted and walked straight to the door. His knock was polite, measured. Every instinct screamed danger. Ruth Anne cracked open the door, keeping her body behind it. "Miss Stoultz, I presume?" The man smiled. Perfect white teeth. "My name is Silas Kerr. I represent the Colorado Central Railroad. Might I have a word?" "About what?" "Your inheritance." His smile didn't waver. "Your parents' property in Pennsylvania. Your Uncle Matthias has been quite helpful sorting details, but we need a few signatures from you. Just formalities." "What kind of formalities?" "Well," Kerr pulled papers from his coat. "It seems your parents' land contains a right-of-way the railroad needs. Your uncle has generously agreed to sell, but as you're a surviving heir, we need your consent. Sign these, and you'll receive your share. $200. Quite generous." $200, more than Ruth Anne had seen in her life, but something was wrong, in Kerr's eyes, and how his companions sat their horses with hands near rifles. "I'll need to read them first," she said slowly, "and talk to Mr. Brandt." Kerr's smile thinned. "Mr. Brandt has no legal standing. You're the heir." "Then I'll read them and think on it." She started closing the door. Kerr's boot stopped it. "Miss Stoultz, I strongly advise signing today. Your uncle completed his portion. If you refuse, you void the entire contract and get nothing. Surely you don't want—" "Take your boot out of my door, Mr. Kerr. Now, let's be reasonable." The unmistakable sound of a rifle cocking froze everything. Caleb stood 30 feet away, rifle aimed at Kerr's head. He'd come through the woods, silent as death. "The lady asked you to move." Kerr's smile vanished. "This is private business. And this is my property. You're on it without permission. That makes it my business." One of Kerr's men reached for his rifle. Caleb shifted aim. "I can put a bullet through your friend's eye before his hand touches that stock." "Want to test me?" The man froze. Kerr slowly removed his boot. "This isn't over, Brandt. That land legally belongs to the railroad. Then you won't mind if Miss Stoultz takes time reviewing your papers, has a lawyer look them over, make sure everything's legal and proper. We have a deadline. Sounds like a you problem." Caleb stepped closer, rifle never wavering. "Now I'm counting to 3. If you're still here after I start shooting, and unlike Timber Ridge's law, I don't miss." Kerr's face went red, but he mounted up. "You're making a mistake, both of you. 1. The 3 men turned their horses. 2. They rode hard down the mountain snow flying. Caleb didn't lower his rifle till they were gone. Then he turned to Ruth Anne in the doorway, her face white. "You all right?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Let me see those papers." Ruth Anne handed them over with shaken hands. Caleb studied them, jaw tightening with each line. "This is theft." He looked up. "Legal theft, but theft. They're offering $200 for land worth thousands. And here," he pointed, This gives them mineral rights. If there's silver or gold on that property, they own it. But Uncle Matthias already signed. Your uncle sold land he doesn't own. Your parents left it to you jointly. Without your signature, the sale isn't valid. Caleb's eyes met hers. That's why he sold you Ruth Anne. He was getting rid of you before you could contest the railroad deal. The world tilted. Ruth Anne sat hard on the step. Everything made sense. The rushed trip west, the drinking, the desperate auction. Matthias hadn't just been cruel, he'd been criminal. "What do I do?" she whispered. Caleb was quiet. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. "That depends. What do you want?" Ruth Anne looked up at this scarred mountain man who'd bought her for $1 and given her shelter and safety and the first kindness since her parents died. The man who'd killed for someone he loved. The man who was still trying to save souls even after his own felt damned. "I want to fight," she said. Her voice came out stronger than expected. "I want to honor my parents' memory, and I want to make sure men like Silas Kerr don't win." Caleb smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face. "Then we fight," he said, "together." He held out his hand, not to help her up, but as an equal, a partner. Ruth Anne took it and stood. Behind them, the cabin door stood open, warmth spilling out into the cold mountain air. Ahead, the path down the mountain led to a town that had mocked her, a railroad that wanted to steal from her, and an uncle who'd sold her like cattle. But she wasn't that terrified girl on the auction block anymore. She was Ruth Anne Stoultz, and she had something worth fighting for. The next 3 days, Ruth Anne learned what work really meant. Not the gentle farm work back in Pennsylvania where Mama would call her in for lemonade when the sun got too high. Not the careful needlework by lamplight while Papa read scripture. This was survival work, the kind that left her hands bleeding and her back screaming and her lungs burning in the thin mountain air. And she loved every second of it. "You're splitting it wrong," Caleb said on the second morning, watching her struggle with the axe. "You're trying to force it. Let the weight do the work." He stepped behind her, his hands covering hers on the handle. "Feel that you're tensing up. Breathe out when you swing." Ruth Anne tried again. The log split clean. "There." His hands dropped away. "You're stronger than you think." She looked down at her palms. Blisters forming. Back home, Mama would have fussed and wrapped them in salve. Here, Caleb just handed her his gloves. "Wear these till you build calluses. Takes about a week." By the third day, Ruth Anne could carry 2 full water buckets from the spring without stopping. Could gut a rabbit without flinching. Could read weather in the sky the way Caleb did, that particular quality of light that meant snow before nightfall. "You're a quick study," Caleb said that evening while they ate venison stew. "Most city folk take months to adjust up here." "I'm not city folk, I'm Amish." Ruth Anne tore off a chunk of bread. "We're practical people." "That why you decided to fight the railroad, practical." Ruth Anne paused, spoon halfway to her mouth. They hadn't talked about Kerr since he'd ridden off. Hadn't talked about what fighting actually meant. "It's not practical at all," she admitted. "Practical would be signing those papers, taking the $200 and disappearing. But my father always said there's a difference between being smart and being right. And fighting's right. Letting them steal from my family because I'm scared, that's not right. That's just giving up." She met his eyes across the table. "You didn't give up when you found your wife. You could have walked away, let someone else deal with Mackenzie." "I killed a man, Ruth Anne, slowly, on purpose. That's not something to admire. I'm not admiring the killing. I'm admiring that you saw something wrong and you fixed it, even if it cost you." Caleb was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Outside, wind whistled through the pines. "It cost more than you know," he finally said. "After Mackenzie, the law wanted me. We had to run. Spent 3 years moving camp every few weeks, never staying anywhere long enough to feel safe. She was pregnant twice. Lost both babies because we couldn't stop running." His hands tightened around his cup. "So yeah, I fixed something, and it broke everything else." Ruth Ann reached across the table. Her hand covered his. "She still married you, still stayed. That means something. It means she was better than I deserved. Or it means she saw what I see. A man who does the right thing even when it's hard." Caleb looked at their hands. Hers smaller, softer, but getting rougher by the day. His scarred and calloused and stained with years of hard living. He didn't pull away. "If we're fighting the railroad," he said quietly, "we need to be smart about it. Kerr's not going to just accept no for an answer. He'll come back with more men, more pressure. Then what do? We go to town, file a legal challenge, make it official that you're contesting the sale." He looked up. "But Ruth Ann, you need to understand. This town, they laughed while your uncle sold you. They're not going to suddenly be on your side." "I don't need them on my side. I just need them to follow their own laws." "Laws don't mean much when the railroad owns the judge." Ruth Ann pulled her hand back. "Then what, we just hide up here and hope they forget about me?" "No." Caleb stood and walked to the window. Snow was starting to fall again, soft and steady. "We make sure you're not alone when you face them. We find allies." "Who's going to ally with the fat Amish girl nobody wanted?" "Don't." His voice came out sharp. "Don't call yourself that. It's what they called me." "I don't care what they called you." He turned from the window. "You're Ruth Anne Stoultz. You're smart and strong, and you split wood like you were born to it. What they called you doesn't define you." Something warm spread through Ruth Ann's chest. Not attraction exactly, something deeper, recognition. Like he saw her as a person instead of a problem. "Thank you," she said softly. Caleb nodded and turned back to the window. "Storm's getting worse. We'll head to town day after tomorrow if it clears. For now, get some rest. Tomorrow, I'm teaching you to shoot." Ruth Ann's eyebrows shot up. "Shoot? You're fighting the railroad. You need to know how to protect yourself." That night, lying in bed with the fur wall between them and the storm raging outside, Ruth Ann stared at the ceiling and thought about what protection meant. Not just rifles and knives, but having someone who believed in you. Someone who saw your worth when the whole world said you had none. "Caleb," she whispered. "Yeah, why do you really care about my land? I mean, it's not your fight." Silence stretched so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then his voice came through the darkness, rough with something that might have been pain. "Because I stood by once and watched someone get hurt. Told myself it wasn't my business, and by the time I decided to act, it was almost too late." Pause. "I'm not making that mistake again." Ruth Ann wanted to ask who he'd stood by for. Wanted to know that story, but something in his voice said that door was closed for now. "Good night, Caleb." "Good night, Ruth Ann." The storm blew itself out by morning. Ruth Ann woke to brilliant sunshine and the sound of Caleb already up moving around the cabin. She dressed quickly in clothes that were becoming familiar now, one of his old shirts tied at the waist with rope and leather pants his wife had made that Ruth Ann had taken in at the seams. "Coffee's ready," Caleb called, "and we're burning daylight." They hiked 20 minutes through fresh snow to a clearing. Caleb set up bottles on a fallen log, then handed Ruth Ann a rifle. "This is a Winchester. Holds 15 rounds. You load here, cock here, aim down these sights." His hands guided hers through the motions. "The kick's going to surprise you the first time. Don't fight it. Let your body absorb it." Ruth Ann raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel. The bottle looked impossibly small. "Breathe out and squeeze. Don't pull." She squeezed. The rifle kicked hard into her shoulder. The bottle exploded. Ruth Ann lowered the gun, stunned. "I hit it." "You did." Caleb was smiling. Actually smiling. "Natural shot. Try the next one." By the time they'd gone through 50 rounds, Ruth Ann could hit 4 out of 5 bottles. Her shoulder would be bruised tomorrow, but she didn't care. She felt powerful, capable. Like maybe she could actually face down Silas Kerr and his railroad thugs. "One more thing," Caleb said. He pulled a knife from his belt. "Close quarters, a rifle's useless. You need to know how to use this." The next hour, he taught her how to hold a knife, where to strike, how to create distance. He moved slow, patient, correcting her grip without making her feel stupid. "The goal isn't to win a knife fight," he explained. "The goal is to hurt them enough to run. You're smaller, so use that. Get in close, strike, fast, get out." They practiced until Ruth Ann's arms shook with exhaustion. When they finally stopped, Caleb handed her a small blade in a leather sheath. "This is yours now. Keep it on you always." Ruth Ann strapped it to her belt. The weight felt strange, foreign, but also reassuring. They walked back to the cabin in comfortable silence, boots crunching through snow. The sun was high and warm despite the cold. Ruth Ann could hear birds calling in the pines, see tracks where deer had passed through. "It's beautiful up here," she said. "It is. Do you ever get lonely?" Caleb was quiet for several steps. "Every day. But lonely's better than surrounded by people who make you feel alone." Ruth Ann understood that. She'd felt alone her whole life back in Pennsylvania. Too big, too awkward, too different. Even in a community that preached togetherness, she'd been apart. "I felt that way too," she admitted. "My whole life I felt like I didn't fit. And now—" Ruth Ann thought about it, thought about the last few days, the work, the exhaustion, the simple rhythm of survival. Thought about sitting across from Caleb at meals, the comfortable silences, the way he taught without condescending. "Now I feel like maybe I was just in the wrong place." They reached the cabin to find a man sitting on the front step. Caleb's rifle came up instantly, but the man raised his hands, showing he was unarmed. "Easy, brother. I come in peace." He was native Shoshone, Ruth Ann guessed from the beadwork on his vest. Maybe 60, with long gray hair and a face carved with laugh lines. He stood slowly, careful not to make sudden moves. "Running elk." Caleb lowered the rifle shock clear on his face. "What are you doing here? Heard you had company." Running Elk's eyes moved to Ruth Ann, and something warm flickered there. Recognition. "Heard you bought a woman in town. Wanted to see if my friend had finally lost his mind or found it again." "I didn't buy her. I saved her. Same thing the way white men do business." Running Elk stepped closer, studying Ruth Ann. "You're the one they were auctioning. The Amish girl." Ruth Ann lifted her chin. "I'm Ruth Anne Stoultz." And you're still here. Most women would have run the first chance they got. He looked between them. Interesting. She's fighting the railroad, Caleb said. They're trying to steal her family's land. Running Elk's expression darkened. The railroad's been stealing from my people for years. What makes you think they'll treat you different? I don't think they will, Ruth Anne said, but I'm going to make them work for it. Running Elk laughed a deep, genuine sound. I like her. She's got spine. He turned to Caleb. You going to help her? I am. Good. Then so am I. Caleb blinked. What? You think you're the only one tired of the railroad rolling over people? I've got 40 families in my camp who've been pushed off their land in the last 5 years. If you're making a stand, we'll stand with you. Ruth Ann's heart started beating faster. Why would you help me? You don't know me. Running Elk's face grew serious. Because Caleb's wife was my niece, and before she died, she made me promise to watch over him, keep him from drowning in his own darkness. He looked at Caleb. This is the first time in 3 years I've seen him actually living instead of just surviving. So yeah, I'll help, because helping you helps him. The words hung in the cold air. Ruth Anne looked at Caleb and saw his jaw working, saw him fighting some emotion he couldn't name. I don't need watching over, Caleb said roughly. No. Then why'd you finally come down from this mountain and get involved in the world again? Running Elk smiled. Seems to me like Ruth Anne here saved you as much as you saved her. That night, they sat around the fire, Ruth Anne, Caleb, and Running Elk, while the old man explained what they were up against. The railroad wants this whole valley, he said, gesturing to encompass the mountains around them. Not just your parents' land in Pennsylvania, Ruth Anne. This land, Caleb's land, my people's land. They're buying it piece by piece using fronts and forged deeds and threats. Your uncle's sale was just one part of a bigger plan. But why this valley? Ruth Anne asked. What's here that's so valuable? Silver, maybe gold. The railroad surveyors found deposits last spring. They're keeping it quiet, buying land cheap before word gets out. Running Elk leaned forward. Your parents' land, did they ever mine it, dig down? Ruth Anne shook her head. They were farmers. They didn't care about what was under the ground. Then they probably didn't know they were sitting on a fortune. And your uncle definitely knows. That's why he's selling. Getting out before the railroad decides to just take it. Caleb stood and paced. So we can't just fight one sale. We have to fight the whole system. Now you're understanding. Running Elk pulled out a pipe and lit it. But here's what they don't expect. They don't expect us to organize, to stand together. One person they can crush, but a whole community, that's harder. What are you suggesting? Ruth Anne asked. I'm suggesting we go to town together. You, me, Caleb, and 10 of my strongest warriors. We march into that land office and file your challenge loud enough that everyone hears. Make it public. Make it impossible for them to make you disappear quietly. The words, make you disappear, sent a chill through Ruth Anne, but she pushed it down. When? She asked. Day after tomorrow. Gives us time to gather my people and gives you time to prepare. Running Elk looked at her seriously. You understand what you're starting. This won't just be a legal fight. The railroad doesn't fight fair. Neither does survival, Ruth Anne said, and I'm done being pushed around. Running Elk grinned. Definitely like her. He left after promising to return in 2 days with his people. Ruth Anne and Caleb stood in the doorway watching him disappear into the trees on his horse. You don't have to do this, Caleb said quietly. Running elk's right. This is going to get dangerous. I know. They might hurt you, or worse. I know that too. Then why? Ruth Anne turned to face him. In the moonlight, his scars looked less severe. Or maybe she'd just gotten used to them. Gotten used to seeing the man instead of the damage. Because for the first time in my life, I feel like I matter. Like what I do makes a difference. Back home, I was just the big girl nobody wanted to marry. Here, I'm someone fighting for something real. She paused. You gave me that by seeing me as a person instead of a problem. And I'm not giving that up just because it's dangerous. Caleb studied her face. Then slowly, carefully, he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was so gentle, it made Ruth Ann's breath catch. You always mattered, he said softly. The world just couldn't see it. They stood there close enough that Ruth Anne could feel the heat coming off him, could count the scars on his face, could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something that looked like hope. We should get some rest, Caleb said, but he didn't move. Yeah, Ruth Anne whispered. We should. Neither of them moved. Then Caleb stepped back, breaking the moment. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Need to make sure we're ready. Ruth Anne nodded, trying to ignore the disappointment in her chest. Good night, Caleb. Good night. But that night, lying in bed with the fur wall between them, Ruth Anne couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about his hand in her hair, about the look in his eyes, about how for a moment she'd thought, I can hear you thinking, Caleb said in the darkness. Sorry. Don't be. Pause. I'm thinking too. About what? Long silence. Then about how I haven't felt this alive in 3 years, and how terrifying that is. Ruth Ann's heart beat faster. Why terrifying? Because last time I cared about someone this much, I lost them, and it almost destroyed me. The admission hung between them. Ruth Anne wanted to turn over to see his face to tell him she understood, but the fur wall was there for a reason. Protection, distance, safety. I'm not going anywhere, she said instead. You say that now. I mean it. Ruth Anne, I mean it, Caleb. Her voice came out fierce. I'm not your wife. I'm not going to ask you to be something you're not. I'm just asking you to let me stand beside you while we fight. That's all. More silence, then so quiet she almost missed it. That's more than I deserve. Stop deciding what you deserve and just accept what's being offered. She heard him shift in the darkness, heard him breathe, and then, okay, one word, but it felt like a promise. Ruth Anne smiled in the darkness and finally let herself sleep. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Caleb taught her how to ride properly, not just sit on a horse, but actually control it. Running Elk returned with 3 of his men, and they spent the afternoon discussing strategy. The land office opens at 9, Running Elk explained. We get there at 8:30 before Kerr's men. File the challenge first thing. Make it official. What about the sheriff? Ruth Anne asked. He seemed friendly with Kerr. Sheriff Tom's not the problem. He's lazy and corrupt, but he follows procedure. As long as we're doing things legal, he can't stop us. Running Elk smiled grimly. It's what happens after the legal part that gets interesting. That evening, Ruth Anne stood in front of the cabin's small mirror, trying to make herself presentable. She'd washed her hair in melted snow, braided it carefully. Wore the cleanest clothes she had still, Caleb's old things, but at least they didn't smell like wood smoke and sweat. You look fine, Caleb said from behind her. I look like a woman wearing a man's clothes. You look like a woman who knows how to work. That's more respectable than any fancy dress. Ruth Anne turned to face him. Are you nervous? Terrified? His honesty surprised her. You don't seem terrified. That's because I've learned to hide it. He stepped closer. But Ruth Ann, I need you to promise me something. If this goes wrong tomorrow, if Kerr brings too many men, or the law turns against us, you run. You get on your horse, and you ride for Running Elk's camp, and you don't look back. I'm not leaving you. You will if I tell you to. No, Ruth Ann crossed her arms. We're in this together. You don't get to be noble and sacrificial. I'm not some damsel you need to save anymore. I know that. Then stop treating me like I am. They stared at each other. Then Caleb's mouth twitched. You're stubborn. I'm Amish. We're all stubborn. It's how we've survived this long. Fair point. He moved past her to check his rifle for the 100th time. Just promise me you'll be smart. If bullets start flying, I'll get down and shoot back. You taught me, remember? That was bottles, not people. A target's a target. Caleb turned to look at her. You say that now, but killing someone changes you. I need you to understand that. If you pull that trigger tomorrow, you don't get to go back to being the person you were before. Ruth Ann thought about the auction block, about Uncle Matthias's hand cracking across her face, about Kerr's polite threats and perfect teeth. Maybe I don't want to go back, she said. Maybe that person was too afraid to fight for herself, and maybe I'm tired of being afraid. Caleb studied her face for a long moment, then he nodded. All right, then tomorrow we fight. That night, Ruth Ann read from his wife's Bible by firelight. Caleb sat across from her, sharpening his knife with long, steady strokes. What are you reading? He asked. Psalm 23. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. She looked up. Seemed appropriate. You really believe that God protects people? I believe God gives people the strength to protect themselves. The rest is up to us. Caleb was quiet. Then, my wife used to say something similar. That prayer wasn't about asking God to fix things. It was about asking for courage to fix things yourself. She sounds like she was very wise. She was. He set down the whetstone. She would have liked you, would have said you had warrior spirit. Is that a compliment? Among her people, the highest one. Ruth Ann closed the Bible carefully. I hope I'm worthy of it. You already are. They went to bed early, knowing tomorrow would come fast. But Ruth Ann couldn't sleep. She lay there listening to Caleb's breathing, thinking about everything that could go wrong. About bullets and blood and courtrooms and judges bought by railroad money. About standing on that auction block again, except this time fighting instead of frozen. Caleb, she whispered. Yeah, if something happens to me tomorrow, nothing's going to happen. But if it does, I want you to know. These last few days living up here with you, learning to be strong. It's been the best week of my life, and I'm grateful for all of it. The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't respond. Then she heard him move, felt him reach across the fur barrier. His hand found hers in the darkness. Nothing's going to happen to you, he said, his voice rough with emotion he wasn't hiding anymore. I won't let it. Ruth Ann squeezed his hand. Then tomorrow we both come home. Together, he agreed. They fell asleep like that, hands clasped across the divide, holding on to each other, and the promise that whatever came next, they'd face it side by side. Dawn came cold and clear. Ruth Ann woke to find Caleb already dressed, loading his rifle with methodical precision. His movements were controlled, deliberate, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "How long have you been up?" she asked. "Couple hours. Couldn't sleep." He didn't look at her. "Running Elk and his men will be here soon. You should eat something." Ruth Ann pushed back the furs and stood. Her body ached from yesterday's riding lesson, but she ignored it. Pain meant she was alive. Pain meant she was fighting. She dressed quickly in the clothes. Caleb had laid out his wife's leather pants, a thick wool shirt, and a coat lined with rabbit fur. The knife he'd given her went on her belt. She checked it twice, making sure the blade moved smoothly in its sheath. "You remember what I taught you?" Caleb asked, finally looking at her. "Breathe out when I squeeze. Let the rifle's weight do the work. And if someone gets close, go for the eyes or throat. And if I tell you to run..." Ruth Ann met his gaze. "I'll run toward trouble, not away from it." Something that might have been pride flickered across his face. "Stubborn woman. You knew that when you bought me. I didn't buy you. Fine. When you rescued me. Better, marginally." They ate in silence cold venison and bread washed down with bitter coffee. Ruth Ann's stomach churned with nerves, but she forced the food down. No telling when she'd eat again. The sound of horses approaching made them both tense. Caleb moved to the window rifle ready. Then he relaxed. "It's running elk." They stepped outside to find not 3 men but 15. All Shoshone, all armed, all looking at Ruth Ann with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Running Elk dismounted and nodded to Caleb. "Told you I'd bring warriors. These men have all lost land to the railroad. They're ready to stand with us." "15's a lot," Caleb said quietly. "That's going to look like aggression." "Good. Let the railroad see we're not playing games." Running Elk turned to Ruth Ann. "You ready for this?" Ruth Ann looked at the assembled men, saw their hard faces, their weapons, their barely contained anger. These weren't just allies. These were men who'd been waiting for an excuse to fight back. "I'm ready," she said, hoping her voice didn't shake. "But I need everyone understanding something. This is a legal fight first. We're filing paperwork, not starting a war. Violence is last resort only." One of the younger warriors snorted. "The railroad doesn't understand legal. They understand force." "Maybe. But if we start shooting first, we're the criminals. We're the ones who get hanged." Ruth Ann stepped forward. "I know you're angry. I'm angry too. But we're smart about this. We use their laws against them. Make them the villains in front of the whole town." The warriors looked at each other, then at Running Elk. "She's right," the old man said. "We go in peaceful. File the papers. Let Kerr make the first move. Then we respond." "And if he doesn't make a move?" another warrior asked. "Then we win without bloodshed, which is better for everyone." Grudging nods. Ruth Ann caught Caleb's eye and saw approval there. She'd handled that right. They mounted up. Ruth Ann on the horse Caleb had given her, a steady mare named Willow. Caleb on Shadow. Running Elk and his men on their own horses creating an intimidating procession. The ride down the mountain took 2 hours. Nobody spoke much. Just the sound of hooves on frozen ground, the creak of leather, the occasional bird call from the trees. Ruth Ann's mind raced. What would she say when they got there? How would she respond to Kerr? What if the land office refused to file her challenge? "Stop thinking so loud," Caleb said, riding beside her. "You're going to think yourself into paralysis." "How do you know what I'm thinking?" "Because I'm thinking the same things. What if this doesn't work? What if we're outnumbered? What if they arrest us before we even get inside?" He looked at her. "But thinking about it doesn't change it. We do what we planned. File the papers, stand our ground, deal with whatever comes." "You make it sound simple." "It is simple. Not easy, but simple. There's a difference." They descended into the valley. Timber Ridge appeared in the distance, a collection of wooden buildings huddled against the cold. Smoke rose from chimneys. Ruth Ann could see people moving in the streets. Her heart started beating faster. "Easy," Caleb murmured. "You've got this." They rode into town at 8:20. The effect was immediate. People stopped what they were doing and stared. Women pulled their children inside. Men reached for rifles they didn't have. The sight of 15 armed Shoshone warriors riding through town with a white mountain man and an Amish girl was enough to freeze everyone. Sheriff Tom stepped out of his office, hand on his pistol. "Caleb Brandt, what's the meaning of this?" "Legal business, Tom. Miss Stoultz is here to file a challenge at the land office. With 15 Indians, with 15 witnesses, Running Elk corrected. We're here peaceful, unless you're planning to make it otherwise." The sheriff's hand stayed on his pistol, but he didn't draw. "You're making people nervous." "Good," Ruth Ann said, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. "People should be nervous when the railroad tries stealing from honest folk. Now, are you going to let me conduct my legal business, or are you going to obstruct justice?" Tom's face reddened. "You got a mouth on you, girl." "I've got rights, and I'm exercising them. Step aside, Sheriff." For a long moment, nobody moved. The whole street seemed to hold its breath. Then Tom stepped aside, muttering under his breath about uppity women and Indian troublemakers. They dismounted outside the land office. Running Elk left 10 of his men with the horses. Caleb, Ruth Ann, and 4 warriors entered the building. The clerk inside looked up and went pale. We're not open yet." "It's 8:30, Ruth Ann said, moving to the counter. "Your sign says you open at 8. I'm here to file a legal challenge to a land sale." What sale?" "The sale of Stoultz property in Pennsylvania to the Colorado Central Railroad. I'm Ruth Anne Stoultz, sole surviving heir, and I'm contesting the transaction." The clerk fumbled for papers. "I'll need to see documentation, proof of identity, evidence of..." "Here." Ruth Ann pulled out the papers Kerr had left, plus the Bible with her parents' names inscribed inside. "My parents' Bible with our family record, the railroad's own documents listing me as heir, and my uncle's forged signature selling land he doesn't own." The clerk studied the papers with shaking hands. Behind Ruth Ann, the warriors stood silent and imposing. The message was clear. This wasn't a request. "This all seems in order," the clerk finally said. "I'll file the challenge, but Miss Stoultz, you should know the railroad has powerful lawyers. This could take months to resolve." "Then it takes months. File it." The clerk started writing. Ruth Ann's hands gripped the counter edge to keep from shaking. She'd done it. Actually done it. Made her stand official and legal. The door behind them slammed open. Silas Kerr stood in the doorway, flanked by 6 men, all armed, all looking ready for violence. "What's the meaning of this?" Kerr's voice was cold. "Miss Stoultz, I thought we had an agreement." "We didn't have anything. You tried forcing me to sign papers I didn't understand. I'm fixing that now." Kerr's eyes swept the room, took in the warriors, Caleb with his rifle, Running Elk standing calm and deadly beside Ruth Anne. His jaw tightened. "This is a waste of everyone's time. That land is already sold. Your uncle had full legal authority." "My uncle had no authority," Ruth Anne interrupted. "The land was left to me and him jointly. Without my signature, the sale is void. The clerk is filing my challenge now, unless you want to obstruct legal proceedings." Kerr's face went red. "You don't know what you're doing. The railroad has invested significant capital based on that sale. If you void it, there will be consequences." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact." "Then let the courts decide the facts." Ruth Anne turned back to the clerk. "Are we done here?" The clerk nodded quickly. "Challenge filed. You'll receive notice when the hearing is scheduled." "Thank you." Ruth Anne took the receipt he handed her and folded it carefully into her coat pocket. Then she turned to face Kerr. "Looks like we'll see each other in court, Mr. Kerr. I look forward to it." She walked toward the door. Kerr didn't move, just stood there blocking the exit, his men at his shoulders. "Move," Caleb said quietly. "This isn't over," Kerr said to Ruth Anne, ignoring Caleb completely. "You think you've won something here? You've just signed your death warrant." "That definitely sounded like a threat," Running Elk observed. "Sheriff's right outside. Want me to fetch him?" Kerr's smile was cold. "I don't make threats, I make promises, and I promise you, Miss Stoultz, you'll regret this." "The only thing I regret," Ruth Anne said, surprised by how calm she felt, "is not standing up to men like you sooner. Now move, before my friends here decide you're obstructing our exit." For a moment, Kerr didn't budge. Then one of Running Elk's warriors shifted forward, hand on his knife. Kerr stepped aside. They walked out into the cold morning air. The street had filled with townspeople all watching. Ruth Anne could feel their eyes on her, judging, calculating. Then someone started clapping. Ruth Anne turned. An older woman stood on the mercantile porch, weathered hands coming together in slow, deliberate applause. She met Ruth Ann's eyes and nodded. Another person joined. Then another. Not everyone. Maybe only a dozen people out of the crowd. But enough. Enough to show that not everyone in Timber Ridge was bought by railroad money. "We should go," Caleb said quietly, "before Kerr gets his courage back." They mounted up and rode out of town at a steady pace, not running, not fleeing, just leaving with dignity and tact. They made it half a mile before Ruth Anne started shaking. She pulled Willow to a stop, dismounted, and bent over with her hands on her knees. Her whole body trembled. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation drained away, leaving her hollow. Caleb was beside her in an instant. "Breathe. Just breathe." "I threatened a railroad agent," Ruth Anne gasped out. "With witnesses. He's going to kill me." "He's going to try. There's a difference." "How are you so calm?" "Because I've been threatened by better men than Silas Kerr. And I'm still here." Caleb's hand was steady on her back. "You did good in there, Ruth Anne. You stood your ground. Didn't back down. That took courage." "I don't feel courageous. I feel terrified." "That's what courage is, being terrified and doing it anyway." Running Elk rode up. "We need to keep moving. Kerr's men could follow." Ruth Anne straightened, wiping her face. "Right. Sorry. I'm fine. You're not fine, but you're functioning. That's good enough." Running Elk looked at Caleb. She can't go back to your cabin. It's the first place they'll look. I know. I'm taking her to your camp. She'll be safer with numbers. What about you? I'm going back to the cabin. If Kerr's men come looking better, they find me than an empty place. Makes them think Ruth Ann ran scared. No, Ruth Ann said immediately. I'm not letting you face them alone. You're not letting me do anything. I'm making a tactical decision. Caleb's voice was firm. Running Elk's camp has 40 people, women and children who can't defend themselves if Kerr decides to attack. You being there gives them warning, gives them a reason to be ready. He's right, Running Elk said. My people need to know what's coming. You can help prepare them. Ruth Ann wanted to argue, wanted to say she wouldn't leave Caleb alone, but the logic was sound, and she was learning to think tactically instead of emotionally. Fine, she said, but if you get yourself killed being noble, I'm going to be very angry. Caleb smiled. Noted. They rode together for another hour before the path split. Running Elk's camp lay to the east, Caleb's cabin to the north. The group halted at the fork. 2 days, Caleb said to Running Elk. Give me 2 days to see what Kerr does. If I'm not at your camp by then, assume the worst. 2 days. Running Elk clasped Caleb's arm. Stay alive, brother. My niece would want that. Caleb nodded. Then he turned to Ruth Ann. She dismounted and walked to Shadow. Caleb swung down to meet her. Be careful, she said. Always am. I mean it, Caleb. Don't do anything stupid or heroic. Can't promise that. Stupid and heroic is kind of my specialty. Ruth Ann hit his arm. It was like hitting a tree trunk. This isn't funny. I know. His expression grew serious. Ruth Ann, listen. If something happens to me, Running Elk will get you to Denver. Get you on a train back east. You'll have enough money to start over. Stop talking like you're going to die. I'm not planning on it, but plans change. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear just like he'd done before. You're strong. Stronger than you know. Whatever happens, you'll survive this. I don't want to just survive. I want to live. And I can't do that if you're not. She stopped. Couldn't finish that sentence. Caleb's hand cupped her cheek. I'll be fine. I've survived worse than Silas Kerr. Then he did something that surprised them both. He leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers. Not a kiss. Something more intimate than that. A connection. A promise. 2 days, he whispered. 2 days, she whispered back. He mounted Shadow and rode north without looking back. Ruth Ann stood there watching until he disappeared into the trees. He'll be all right, Running Elk said gently. Caleb's hard to kill. Trust me, I've known him 20 years. He's survived things that would have destroyed lesser men. That doesn't make me feel better. It should. It means he's coming back. They rode to Running Elk's camp in silence. Ruth Ann's mind kept replaying the morning. The land office, Kerr's threats, Caleb's forehead against hers. The camp appeared in a valley sheltered by pines. 20 lodges arranged in a circle, smoke rising from central fires. Women looked up as they approached. Children stopped playing. Running Elk raised his hand. Friends, we have a guest. This is Ruth Anne Stoultz. She stands against the railroad with us. While she's here, she's under our protection. A woman stepped forward, maybe 40, with kind eyes and gray streaking her black hair. I'm Morning Star, Running Elk's wife. You're welcome here, Ruth Ann. Thank you. Ruth Ann dismounted. Her legs were shaky from hours of riding. I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden. You're a warrior who stood up to our enemy. That makes you family." Morning Star took Ruth Ann's arm. "Come, you need food and rest. Then we'll talk about what comes next." The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Morning Star taught Ruth Anne how to move through the camp, where things were stored, how to help with daily work. The other women were initially wary, but Ruth Ann's willingness to work hauling water, preparing food, mending clothes won them over. The men spent their time preparing defenses, sharpening weapons, planning watch rotations. Everyone knew Kerr might retaliate. Ruth Anne slept in Morning Star's lodge, but she didn't sleep much. Every sound made her jump. Every horse approaching made her reach for the knife on her belt. "You're worried about Caleb," Morning Star said on the second night. They sat by the fire working on mending a hunting shirt. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to anyone with eyes." Morning Star smiled. "He's a good man, broken but good. My sister saw that in him, loved him despite his darkness. I'm not trying to replace her. No one thinks you are, but you're helping him heal. That's a gift." Morning Star's needle moved through leather with practiced ease. "My sister made him promise before she died that he'd find a reason to keep living. Not just surviving, but living. I think he's found that reason." Ruth Ann's throat tightened. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to be someone's reason. You stood on an auction block and didn't break. You faced down a railroad agent with armed men. You filed legal papers knowing it might get you killed." Morning Star looked at her. "If that's not strength, I don't know what is." "That wasn't strength. That was terror and stubbornness. Sometimes they're the same thing." That night, Ruth Anne lay awake listening to the camp settle. Tomorrow was the deadline. 2 days. If Caleb didn't come by noon, Running Elk would send men to check the cabin. Please, she prayed to whoever might be listening. Please, let him be all right. Dawn came with the sound of a horse approaching fast. Ruth Anne scrambled out of the lodge, knife in hand. Other people emerged, weapons ready. A single rider burst through the trees. Caleb. He looked exhausted, his face drawn and his clothes torn. But alive. He was alive. Ruth Anne ran before she could stop herself. Caleb dismounted and caught her as she crashed into him. His arms came around her solid and real. "I'm fine," he said into her hair. "I'm fine." "What happened?" Running Elk demanded. Caleb gently set Ruth Anne back and turned to face the gathering crowd. "Kerr's men came last night, 6 of them. They tried burning my cabin with me in it." Gasps from the assembled people. Ruth Ann's hand flew to her mouth. "What did you do?" Running Elk asked. "Went out the back window, picked them off one by one in the dark. I know those woods better than anyone. They didn't stand a chance." Caleb's expression was grim. 2 dead, 4 ran. I let them run so they could report back to Kerr." "You killed 2 men," Ruth Anne whispered. "They were trying to burn me alive. I didn't have much choice." He looked at her. "I'm sorry you have to know that about me. But that's who I am. That's what I do to protect what's mine." Ruth Anne processed that. 2 men dead. Because of her challenge. Because she'd stood up to the railroad. "This is war now," Running Elk said. "Kerr's not going to stop. He'll keep coming." "I know. That's why I came here. We need to move Ruth Anne. Get her somewhere Kerr can't reach." "No," Ruth Anne said. Everyone turned to look at her. "No," she repeated stronger this time. "I'm not running. I'm not hiding. I filed that challenge legally. If Kerr wants to kill me for it, he'll have to do it in front of witnesses, in daylight, in town where everyone can see." "Ruth Ann," Caleb started. "No, listen to me. If I run, Kerr wins. He gets to steal the land and nobody stands up to him. But if I stay, if I keep fighting, if I make enough noise that people pay attention, maybe the railroad loses for once." "You'll get killed," Caleb said flatly. "Maybe, or maybe I'll win." Ruth Ann looked around at the assembled people. "How many of you have lost land to the railroad? How many have watched them take everything while you stood by because you were alone?" Hands slowly rose, nearly everyone. "What if we're not alone anymore?" Ruth Ann's voice grew stronger. "What if we organize? What if we all file challenges? What if we make so much legal trouble that the railroad has to actually follow the law?" "They'll just kill us all," someone muttered. "They can't kill everyone, not without consequences, not if the territorial governor gets involved." Ruth Ann turned to Running Elk. "You said the railroad doesn't expect us to organize, so let's organize. Let's make this bigger than just my land. Let's make this about all of us." Running Elk looked at Caleb. "She's either brilliant or insane." "Both," Caleb said, but there was pride in his voice. "Definitely both." "So what's the plan?" Morning Star asked. Ruth Ann took a breath. This was it. The moment she stopped being a victim and became a leader. "We go back to town. All of us. We hold a public meeting, invite everyone who's lost land, document every illegal sale, every forged deed, every threat. We compile it all and send it to the territorial governor." She looked at Caleb. "And we dare Kerr to stop us." The camp erupted in discussion. Some people thought it was brilliant, others thought it was suicide. Running Elk raised his hand for silence. "We'll vote. All in favor of Ruth Ann's plan." More hands went up than down. "Then it's decided. We organize." Running Elk smiled grimly. "The railroad wanted a fight. Let's give them one." That night, sitting by the fire with Caleb beside her and plans being made, all around, Ruth Ann felt something shift inside her. She wasn't the fat Amish girl nobody wanted anymore. She wasn't the terrified woman on the auction block. She was Ruth Anne Stoultz. And she was done being afraid. "You know, this is crazy," Caleb said quietly. "I know. You know we might die. I know that too. And you're still doing it." Ruth Ann looked at him, at this scarred, broken man who'd saved her life and taught her to be strong. "You asked me once what I wanted. I want to matter. I want my life to mean something. If I die fighting for that, at least I'll die as myself." Caleb studied her face in the firelight. Then he reached over and took her hand. "Then we die as ourselves, together." "Together," Ruth Ann agreed. And somewhere in the darkness, she knew Silas Kerr was making his own plans. The war had started. But for the first time, Ruth Ann wasn't afraid of what came next. She was ready. They rode into Timber Ridge 3 days later with 40 people behind them. Not just warriors this time, families. Women with babies on their backs. Old men who'd lost everything to railroad greed. White settlers who'd been cheated alongside the Shoshone. A coalition of the desperate and the determined. Ruth Ann rode at the front beside Caleb and Running Elk. Her hands were steady on the reins now, no shaking, no fear, just cold, focused purpose. "Remember the plan," Caleb said quietly. "We gather at the church. Public meeting. Keep it peaceful. Let them make the first move." "And if they don't let us gather?" Ruth Ann asked. "Then we gather anyway. They can arrest all 40 of us, or they can let us speak. Their choice." The town came into view. Ruth Ann could see people stopping in the streets pointing. A crowd this size was unprecedented. Threatening. Exactly what they needed. Sheriff Tom stood outside his office, hand on his pistol. But he didn't move to stop them as they rode past. Couldn't. Not legally. Not with this many witnesses. They dismounted at the church. Reverend Matthews stood on the steps, his face pale but determined. He'd agreed to host the meeting after Ruth Ann had ridden to his home 2 nights ago and laid out the evidence of railroad corruption. "God's house is open to all who seek justice," he'd said then. Now, facing 40 armed people, he looked less certain. But he held his ground. "Reverend," Ruth Ann said, dismounting, "thank you for this. I pray I'm doing the right thing." His hands twisted together. "The railroad contributes significantly to this church. If they withdraw their support, then you'll find new support from people who actually believe in what this building stands for." Ruth Ann moved past him into the church. "Let's begin." The church filled quickly. Families from the camp, townspeople who'd lost land, a few curious onlookers. Caleb positioned himself by the door, rifle visible. Running Elk and his men spread throughout the room, protection and deterrent in equal measure. Ruth Ann stood at the front, her father's Bible in her hands, the same Bible she'd carried on the auction block, the same Bible that had traveled from Pennsylvania to this moment. "Most of you don't know me," she began. Her voice carried through the silent room. "My name is Ruth Anne Stoultz. 2 weeks ago, my uncle sold me on an auction block in the town square for $1, because I was inconvenient, because I stood between him and railroad money." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people looked away ashamed. They'd been there. They'd watched. But I'm not here to talk about my humiliation. I'm here to talk about theft, legal theft, the kind where men in expensive suits use forged papers and corrupt officials to steal what doesn't belong to them. Ruth Ann opened the Bible to where she'd marked pages. "My father wrote something in here before he died. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Not the railroads, not Silas Kerr's, the Lord's, and we're just stewards of it." "Oh, men," someone said quietly, "the Colorado Central Railroad has been buying land in this valley for 2 years. They've used every dirty trick imaginable. Forged deeds, falsified surveys, threats, violence." Ruth Ann's voice grew stronger. "How many of you have lost land to them?" Hands rose throughout the room, more than half the people there. "How many were told you had no choice, that you'd signed papers you never actually signed?" More hands. "How many were threatened, told your families would suffer if you didn't cooperate?" Nearly everyone's hand was up now. "That's what I thought." Ruth Ann closed the Bible. "So, here's what we're going to do. We're going to document every illegal sale, every forged signature, every threat, and we're going to send it all to the territorial governor in Denver. We're going to make so much legal noise that the railroad can't ignore us anymore." "They'll kill us," a woman called out. "They've killed before." "Maybe, but maybe they won't. Because killing one person, one family, that's easy to hide. Killing 40 families, that's a massacre. That gets attention. That brings federal marshals." Ruth Ann looked around the room. We're stronger together than we are alone. That's what they don't want us to realize. The church door slammed open. Silas Kerr stood in the entrance with 10 armed men. His face was red with barely controlled rage. "This gathering is illegal," he announced. "You're trespassing on church property without permission." "I gave a permission," Reverend Matthews said, surprising everyone, including himself. "This is God's house, not yours." Kerr's eyes narrowed. "Reverend, I'd reconsider that position. Your church relies heavily on railroad funding. Then I'll rely on God instead. Seems more reliable." The Reverend's voice shook but held firm. "These people have a right to assemble peacefully. There's nothing peaceful about 40 armed Indians in a church." "Funny," Running Elk said from the back. "I was thinking the same thing about 10 armed white men interrupting a prayer meeting." Nervous laughter rippled through the room. Kerr's face went darker. "Miss Stoultz," he said, turning his attention to Ruth Anne, "I'm giving you one final chance. Sign the papers, take the money, walk away. If you don't, what happens next is on your head." Ruth Anne met his gaze without flinching. "What happens next is you leave this church. We continue our meeting. And tomorrow morning, a packet of evidence gets sent to Denver documenting every crime the railroad has committed in this valley. You have no evidence. I have 40 witnesses. I have forged documents. I have death threats written in your handwriting." Ruth Anne held up a sheaf of papers. Running Elk's people kept everything, every letter, every false deed, every receipt showing land sold for a fraction of its value. It's all here, and it's all going to the governor. Kerr's jaw worked. Ruth Anne could see him calculating. Could see the moment he realized she wasn't bluffing. "You're making a grave mistake," he said quietly. "The only mistake I made was not fighting back sooner. Now get out of this church before I have you arrested for threatening witnesses." "On what authority?" "Mine." Sheriff Tom's voice came from behind Kerr. He stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "I may be lazy, and I may look the other way sometimes, but I'm not letting you threaten people in a church. That's where I draw the line." Kerr turned slowly. "Sheriff, I'd think very carefully about what you're doing." "I am thinking carefully. I'm thinking about how the territorial governor would react to hearing that a sheriff allowed witnesses to be intimidated during a legal gathering." Tom's hand rested on his pistol. "I'm thinking that might cost me my badge, and I like my badge. So you're leaving, now." For a long moment, no one moved. The tension in the church was thick enough to cut. Ruth Ann's hand drifted to the knife on her belt. Caleb shifted his rifle. Running Elk's warriors tensed. Then Kerr smiled, cold and calculated. "This isn't over," he said. "Not even close." He turned and walked out. His men followed, but Ruth Anne saw one of them glance back, memorizing faces, making a list. The door closed. Everyone released their breath at once. "That went better than expected," Running Elk said dryly. "That went terribly," Caleb corrected. "He's going to retaliate hard. Let him." Ruth Ann's hands were shaking now that the confrontation was over, but she kept her voice steady. "We knew this wouldn't be easy. We knew there'd be consequences, but we're doing this right. Legal, public, with witnesses. That's our protection." "Protection doesn't stop bullets," someone muttered. "No, but it makes those bullets matter. It makes them crimes that can't be ignored." Ruth Anne looked around the room. Everyone who's willing to sign a statement about railroad corruption, see Run an Elk. Everyone who has documents, bring them to me. We compile everything tonight. Send it to Denver tomorrow. After that, it's out of our hands." The meeting continued for another hour. People came forward one by one telling stories of theft and intimidation. Ruth Ann took notes, her hand cramping from writing. Caleb stood guard by the door. The Reverend provided coffee and encouragement. By the time they finished, Ruth Ann had 37 signed statements and a pile of evidence 2 inches thick. Enough to bury the railroad if the governor actually looked at it. "Will he, though?" Morning Star asked quietly. "The governor. Will he care about us?" "I don't know," Ruth Ann admitted. "But we have to try. What's the alternative? Give up? Let them win." "The alternative is survival. Sometimes that means surrender." "No." Ruth Ann's voice came out fierce. "Survival means fighting for the right to exist. Surrender is just slow death. I won't do that. I won't tell my children someday that I had a chance to stand up and I chose not to, even if it costs me everything." Morning Star studied her face, then nodded slowly. "You really believe that?" "I have to. Because if I don't believe it, what's the point of any of this?" They left the church as the sun was setting. The town watched them go in silence. Some faces showed support, others showed fear, most showed nothing at all. "We need to split up," Caleb said once they were clear of town. "Traveling together makes us a target. Small groups move faster, hide easier." "Where do we go?" Ruth Ann asked. "Back to camp for now. Tomorrow, Run an Elk and I take the evidence to Denver. You stay with Morning Star and the others." "No," Ruth Ann's response was immediate. "I'm going to Denver. It's a 3-day ride through territory Kerr controls. Too dangerous. Everything's dangerous now. At least in Denver, I can testify to the governor myself. Face to face, not just words on paper." Caleb looked at Running Elk. The old man shrugged. "She's not wrong. A young woman telling her story is more powerful than just documents. Human element matters." "I don't like it," Caleb said. "You don't have to like it," Ruth Ann replied. "You just have to accept it. I'm going." They argued about it the whole ride back to camp. Caleb listed every danger, every risk, every possible thing that could go wrong. Ruth Ann countered each one with stubborn determination. Finally, as they reached the camp, Caleb pulled Shadow to a stop and turned to face her directly. "Why are you so determined to put yourself in danger? You've already done more than anyone expected. You've filed the challenge, gathered the evidence, organized the resistance. Let someone else take it from here." Ruth Ann met his gaze. "Because this is my fight, my family's land, my parents' legacy. I won't let someone else finish it for me. I need to see this through to the end, whatever that end is. Even if that end is you getting killed, even then. Because at least I'll die trying, at least I'll die as someone who mattered." She reached over and gripped his hand. "You, of all people, should understand that. You killed for someone you loved. You're willing to die protecting me. Why is it so hard to believe I'd do the same for what I love?" Caleb's jaw worked. Then he squeezed her hand back. "Because I've already lost one person I cared about. I don't want to lose another." The admission hung between them. Ruth Ann's breath caught. Around them, the camp was settling in for the night. But in this moment, it was just the two of them on horseback in the fading light. "You're not going to lose me," Ruth Ann said softly. You can't promise that. No, but I can promise I'll fight like hell to come back because I have something to come back to now. She met his eyes. Someone to come back to. Caleb lifted her hand and pressed it to his scarred cheek. The gesture was tender, vulnerable, everything his rough exterior usually hid. Then we go to Denver together, he said, and we both come back. Deal. Deal. They made camp that night with extra guards posted. Everyone knew Kerr wouldn't let the church meeting go unanswered. The question was when he'd strike, not if. Ruth Anne couldn't sleep. She lay in Morning Star's lodge listening to the sounds of the camp. Horses nickering, low conversations, the crackle of fires. "You're awake," Morning Star said from across the lodge. "Can't turn my mind off. Worried about tomorrow. Worried about everything." Ruth Anne rolled onto her side. "What if we get to Denver and the governor doesn't care? What if all of this was for nothing?" Morning Star was quiet for a moment. "My sister used to say that fighting for what's right is never for nothing. Even if you lose, you've proven that someone cared enough to try. You've shown others that resistance is possible." "But people could die, have already died. Caleb killed 2 men because of me. Caleb killed 2 men because they tried to murder him. That's not your fault. That's theirs." Morning Star sat up. "Ruth Anne, you're carrying weight that isn't yours to carry. You didn't create this situation. The railroad did. Kerr did. Your uncle did. You're just refusing to be a victim anymore. That's not the same as causing harm. Then why does it feel like I'm responsible for everything that goes wrong?" "Because you're a good person. Good people always question themselves. It's the bad ones who sleep soundly." Morning Star moved closer. "Listen to me. What you're doing is brave and necessary. People are following you because you give them hope. Don't take that away from them by drowning in guilt." Ruth Anne wiped her eyes. "I'm scared." "Good. Scared means you understand the stakes. Scared keeps you sharp." Morning Star gripped her shoulder. "But don't let scared turn into paralyzed. You've come too far to stop now." The next morning, Ruth Anne woke before dawn to find Caleb already packing supplies for the Denver trip. 3 horses, food for a week, extra ammunition. He worked with quiet efficiency, his face set in determined lines. "Morning," Ruth Anne said. "Morning. Running elks, making final preparations. We leave in an hour." Ruth Anne began helping him pack. They worked in comfortable silence until Ruth Anne noticed something. "Is that your wife's dress?" She pointed to a bundle of soft leather. Caleb nodded. "Thought you might want something nicer for meeting the governor. More formal than men's clothes." Ruth Anne carefully unfolded it. The dress was beautiful. Intricate beadwork. Butter-soft leather. Made for someone who'd been loved. "I can't wear this." "She'd want you to. She always said her clothes should be worn, not stored away gathering dust. That wearing them kept her memory alive." Caleb's voice was rough. "Besides, you need to look presentable. Governor's not going to take us seriously if we show up looking like wilderness folk." Ruth Anne held the dress to her chest. It felt like an honor and a responsibility all at once. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet. Wait till we actually make it to Denver alive." They departed as the sun rose, casting long shadows across the valley. Running Elk rode ahead as scout. Caleb and Ruth Anne followed. Behind them, the camp watched them go, with a mixture of hope and fear. The first day passed without incident. They stuck to game trails and avoided main roads. camped in a hidden canyon that night, took turns keeping watch. Ruth Anne wore the dress. It fit surprisingly well, just needed the belt tightened. She caught Caleb looking at her several times, something complicated in his expression. "What?" she finally asked. "You look like her, not in appearance, in spirit. That strength she had, that refusal to be broken." He poked at the fire. "It's unsettling." "I'm sorry if this is painful." "Don't apologize, it's not painful. It's—" He struggled for words. "It's like a door I thought was closed forever is opening again, and I'm not sure if I'm ready to walk through it." Ruth Anne understood what he wasn't saying, what they were both feeling but neither had voiced. This thing growing between them, this connection that went beyond gratitude or convenience. "We don't have to figure everything out right now," she said quietly. "Let's just focus on Denver, on the governor, on surviving. Everything else can wait." Caleb nodded, looking relieved. "Yeah, one crisis at a time." But that night, when they lay down to sleep with Running Elk on watch, Caleb reached across the space between their bedrolls and took her hand. Ruth Anne squeezed back, and they fell asleep like that, connected in the darkness. The second day brought trouble. Running Elk returned at midday riding hard. "Riders behind us, 6 men, armed, moving fast." "Kerr's men?" Caleb asked. "Who else? They're 2 hours back, but gaining." They pushed the horses harder, tried to outrun pursuit, but by late afternoon the riders were close enough to see. "We can't outrun them," Running Elk said. "Horses are tired. We need to make a stand." Caleb scanned the landscape. "That ridge, good defensive position. We can hold them there." They rode hard for the ridge, dismounted, found cover behind rocks. Ruth Anne checked her rifle with shaking hands. She'd shot bottles. She'd never shot at a person. "Remember what I taught you," Caleb said, positioning himself beside her. "Breathe out, squeeze, don't pull, and Ruth Anne, don't hesitate. They're here to kill us. Show them mercy, and they'll show you none." The riders approached, slowly spreading out. Ruth Anne recognized 2 of them from Kerr's group at the church. The others were hired guns, hard-faced men who killed for money. They stopped about 100 yards out. One of them cupped his hands and shouted, "Miss Stoultz, Mr. Kerr wants to talk. Come down peaceful and nobody gets hurt." "That's a lie," Running Elk muttered. "I know," Ruth Anne called back. "Tell Mr. Kerr if he wants to talk he can come to Denver. We'll be at the governor's office tomorrow." "Can't let you do that, ma'am. Mr. Kerr was real clear. You don't reach Denver. Then you'll have to stop us. And stopping us means killing us. You prepared to murder 3 people in cold blood. Have that on your conscience?" The man laughed. "Lady, I killed my conscience years ago. Made life a lot easier." He reached for his rifle. Caleb fired. The man dropped, clutching his shoulder. Chaos erupted. The other riders scattered, finding cover, returning fire. Bullets pinged off rocks around Ruth Ann's head. "Shoot!" Caleb yelled. Ruth Anne sighted down her rifle. A man's head appeared over a rock. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked. The man ducked. She didn't know if she hit him. The firefight lasted maybe 5 minutes but felt like hours. Ruth Anne fired until her rifle was empty, reloaded with fumbling fingers, fired again. The noise was deafening. Smoke stung her eyes. Then silence. Ruth Ann's ears rang. She looked around frantically. Caleb was bleeding from a cut on his forehead but otherwise intact. Running Elk had taken a bullet through his upper arm but was already binding it. Below, the riders were retreating. 3 horses galloped away. 3 bodies lay on the ground. "They're running, Elk," said, sounding surprised. "We had better position, better shots. They weren't expecting real resistance." Caleb wiped blood from his face. "But they'll regroup. Bring more men. We need to move." They rode through the night, pushing exhausted horses to their limit. Ruth Ann's whole body shook with adrenaline crash. She'd been in a gunfight. She'd shot at people, maybe even killed someone. "You did good," Caleb said at one point. "You held your ground, didn't panic." "I killed someone. You defended yourself. There's a difference. Is there? They're still dead. They came to murder you, Ruth Anne. You gave them a choice. They chose violence. What happened after that is on them." Ruth Anne wanted to believe that, wanted to push down the sick feeling in her stomach, but the image of that man's head disappearing behind the rock kept replaying in her mind. They reached Denver's outskirts at dawn of the 3rd day, all of them exhausted, wounded, covered in dust and dried blood, but alive, and carrying evidence that could change everything. "The governor's mansion is on Lincoln Street," Running Elk said. "We go straight there. No stopping, no detours." They rode through Denver's waking streets. People stared at the sight of 2 Indians and a white woman in blood-stained leather riding like their lives depended on it. The governor's mansion was an imposing brick building with guards at the gate. One of them stepped forward as they approached. "State your business." "We're here to see Governor Pitkin," Ruth Anne said, her voice hoarse. "We have evidence of railroad corruption, murder, theft, and we need to deliver it before the men trying to kill us catch up." The guard looked skeptical. "The governor doesn't see people without appointments." "Then he's going to miss one hell of a story." Ruth Anne reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the sheaf of documents. "Tell him Ruth Anne Stoultz is here. Tell him I have proof that the Colorado Central Railroad has stolen over 50,000 acres through fraud. Tell him people have died. And tell him if he turns me away, I'm going straight to every newspaper in Denver and telling them why." The guard hesitated. Then he turned and went inside. 5 minutes later, another man emerged. Older, distinguished with intelligent eyes and a carefully trimmed beard. "I'm Governor Pitkin," he said, studying them. "You look like you've been through hell." "We have," Ruth Anne said, "and we need your help to make sure it wasn't for nothing." The governor looked at the documents in her hand, at the blood on Caleb's face, at Running Elk's bandaged arm, at Ruth Ann's determined expression. "Come inside," he said. "Let's hear what you have to say." Ruth Anne dismounted on shaking legs. Caleb steadied her. Running Elk tied the horses. Together they walked through those mansion doors, carrying the weight of 40 families' hopes on their shoulders. Behind them, somewhere in the city, Kerr's men were coming. But for now, they were safe. And they had the governor's ear. It was enough. It had to be enough. Governor Pitkin's study smelled like leather and tobacco. Ruth Anne sat in a chair too fine for someone who'd spent the last 3 days running for her life. Caleb stood behind her, refusing to sit. Running Elk leaned against the wall, his wounded arm held close to his chest. The governor spread the documents across his mahogany desk. Signed statements, forged deeds, letters written in Silas Kerr's own hand, threatening families who wouldn't sell, evidence of murders covered up by corrupt local law. "This is damning," Pitkin said quietly. He looked up at Ruth Anne, If even half of this is true, the Colorado Central Railroad has committed crimes that warrant federal intervention. It's all true, Ruth Anne said. Every word, every signature. We wouldn't risk our lives bringing you lies. Why not go to the territorial marshal? Why come directly to me? Because the marshal answers to judges the railroad owns. Because local law is bought and paid for. Because you're the only person with enough power to actually do something. Ruth Anne leaned forward. Governor, 40 families are counting on you. They're hiding in the mountains right now, waiting to hear if justice still exists in Colorado territory. Pitkin picked up one document in particular. A deed showing a Shoshone family's land sold for $5. The signature was clearly forged. I recognize this family, he said. They came to me 2 years ago with a similar complaint. I told them to take it to the courts. He set the paper down heavily. The courts ruled against them. The judge who made that ruling is now on the railroad's payroll. Consultant fees, they call it. So you knew, Caleb set his voice hard. You knew the railroad was corrupt, and you did nothing. I suspected. Suspicion and proof are different things. Pitkin met Caleb's gaze without flinching. You think I don't see what happens in my own territory? I see it. But fighting the railroad means fighting the men who fund elections. The men who build the infrastructure this territory needs to become a state. One wrong move, and I'm removed from office, replaced by someone who'll look the other way permanently. So you look the other way temporarily. Instead, Ruth Ann's voice came out sharper than intended. How is that better? It's better because I'm still here, still in position to act when I have enough evidence to make charges stick. Pitkin tapped the documents. This is that evidence. This is enough to bring federal marshals, enough to freeze the railroad's land acquisitions while investigations proceed. Maybe even enough to void fraudulent sales. Hope flared in Ruth Ann's chest. So you'll help us? I'll help you, but you need to understand what that means. Pitkin stood and walked to the window. The moment I move against the railroad, they'll know someone brought me evidence. They'll come for you, all of you, and they'll come hard. They're already coming hard, Running Elk said dryly. We fought off 6 men yesterday, killed 3. More are probably on their way here right now. Then you'll stay here tonight, under guard. Tomorrow I'll bring in federal marshals and we'll start the legal process. Pitkin turned back to face them. But, Miss Stoultz, I want you to think carefully about what happens next. Once this becomes official, you become the face of this fight. People will look to you. The railroad will target you. Your life will never be quiet again. Ruth Anne thought about the auction block, about standing there in torn clothes while men laughed, about Uncle Matthias's hand across her face, about every moment of her life when she'd been powerless. Quiet's overrated, she said. I'll take loud and alive over quiet and broken. Pitkin smiled slightly. I believe you will. All right, let's make some noise. He called for his secretary and began dictating orders, telegrams to federal marshals, warrants for Kerr's arrest, injunctions freezing all railroad land transactions pending investigation. The machinery of justice grinding into motion. A servant showed them to guest rooms. Ruth Anne barely registered the luxury. Soft bed, clean sheets, hot water for washing. She stood in the middle of the room still wearing his wife's blood-stained dress and started shaking. A knock on the door. Caleb entered without waiting for permission. You all right? I killed someone today, maybe more than one. Ruth Ann's voice came out flat. I shot at people and I don't even know if they died or if they're just wounded somewhere bleeding out." Caleb closed the door behind him. "I know. How do you live with it, the knowing, the remembering?" "You don't. You just keep moving forward because stopping means drowning in it." He crossed to her and gently took the rifle she was still holding. She hadn't even realized she hadn't put it down. "Ruth Ann, look at me." She met his eyes, those dead eyes that weren't quite so dead anymore. "You did what you had to do to survive, to protect yourself and us. Those men made their choice. They came hunting and found out their prey had teeth." His hand cupped her cheek. "That's not murder. That's justice. It doesn't feel like justice. It feels like I'm becoming something I don't recognize." "You're becoming strong. That's different than becoming cruel. Strong is what keeps you alive, what keeps you fighting for people who can't fight for themselves." Caleb's thumb brushed away a tear she didn't know had fallen. "My wife used to say that the world breaks everyone, and afterward some people are stronger in the broken places. You're stronger, Ruth Ann. Not broken. Stronger." Ruth Ann leaned into his touch. "I'm tired, Caleb. So tired." "I know. So rest. I'll keep watch." "You need rest too. I'll rest when you're safe, not before." He guided her to the bed, helped her sit, started to turn away. Ruth Ann caught his hand. "Stay, please. I don't want to be alone with my thoughts right now." Caleb hesitated. Then he sat beside her on the bed. Ruth Ann leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Tell me something good," she whispered. "Tell me about the valley in spring, about what it looks like when everything's not covered in snow and blood." So Caleb told her about wildflowers carpeting the meadows, about deer bringing their fawns to the stream, about the way sunrise painted the mountains gold and pink, about his wife teaching him the names of plants in Shoshone, about quiet mornings and peaceful evenings and a life that felt whole. Ruth Ann listened until his voice lulled her to sleep. Caleb stayed there holding her, keeping watch like he'd promised, and for a few hours the nightmares stayed away. Morning brought chaos. Ruth Ann woke to shouting downstairs. She grabbed her rifle and ran into the hallway. Caleb was already there, running elk beside him. "What's happening?" "Railroad men at the gates," Caleb said grimly, "demanding to see the governor, claiming we murdered their people." They hurried downstairs. Governor Pitkin stood in the foyer with 6 federal marshals. Through the window, Ruth Ann could see at least 20 men outside the gates. Some she recognized from Kerr's group, others were new faces, all armed. "This is private property," Pitcairn was saying through the door, "and these people are under my protection. If you have charges to file, do it through proper legal channels." "We have witnesses," someone shouted. "These murderers killed 3 men in cold blood yesterday." "We defended ourselves," Ruth Ann called out before anyone could stop her. "Your men ambushed us on the road, tried to kill us to keep us from reaching Denver. We fought back. That's not murder. That's survival. You don't get to decide that, girl. Neither do you. The courts decide. And lucky for us, the governor's already contacted federal marshals." Ruth Ann's voice rang clear and strong. "So go ahead. File your charges. Let's see whose story holds up under oath." Silence from outside. Then Silas Kerr's voice, smooth and cold. "Governor Pitkin, this is a misunderstanding. These people have filled your head with lies. The railroad is a legitimate business." A legitimate business doesn't send armed men to murder witnesses, Pitkin interrupted. A legitimate business doesn't forge deeds and threaten families. A legitimate business doesn't need to operate the way you've been operating, Mr. Kerr. You have no proof. I have 2 inches of proof sitting on my desk. Signed statements, documents in your own handwriting, evidence that's already been copied and sent to the federal marshal's office in case something happens to the originals. Pitkin's voice hardened. You wanted to play rough, Mr. Kerr. Let's play rough. Federal marshals are issuing warrants for your arrest as we speak. You and 12 of your associates. Charges include fraud, extortion, conspiracy to commit murder, and about 30 other crimes. The silence outside stretched longer this time. You're making a mistake, Kerr finally said. No, I'm correcting one. Now, disperse before I have you arrested for threatening a government official. Footsteps retreated. Horses rode away. But Ruth Ann knew this wasn't over. Kerr wouldn't give up that easily. He'll come back, she said quietly. Let him, one of the marshals said. He was a big man with a scar across his jaw and eyes that had seen too much. We're ready, and unlike local law, we can't be bought. The next 3 days were a blur of legal proceedings. Federal marshals arrested Kerr and his top men. The railroad's lawyers descended on Denver like locusts filing motions and counterclaims. The territorial courts were overwhelmed. Ruth Ann spent hours giving testimony, answering questions, identifying documents, facing down lawyers who tried to paint her as a liar, a troublemaker, a woman too stupid to understand business. Miss Stoultz, one lawyer said with barely concealed contempt, isn't it true that you were sold at auction for $1, that your own family considered you worthless? My uncle considered me inconvenient, Ruth Ann replied calmly. There's a difference. And yes, I was sold. That's why I understand exactly what your client is trying to do. Turn people into commodities. Strip them of dignity and rights. Make them so desperate they'll accept anything. I know what that feels like. And I'm done accepting it. The courtroom was packed with observers. Reporters scribbling notes. Townspeople from Timber Ridge who'd traveled to Denver to see what happened. Some supporting Ruth Ann, others glaring. On the 3rd day, the judge made his ruling. After reviewing the evidence presented, this court finds sufficient cause to void all land transactions made by the Colorado Central Railroad in Timber Ridge Valley pending full investigation. The judge's gavel came down. Furthermore, the court issues an injunction preventing any new purchases or development until said investigation is complete. Mr. Kerr, you and your associates will remain in custody until trial. The courtroom erupted, cheers from some, angry shouts from others. Ruth Ann sat there numb with disbelief. They'd won. Not completely, not permanently, but they'd won this round. Caleb's hand found hers under the table. She squeezed it tight, feeling tears slip down her cheeks. She'd done it. Actually done it. Stood up to the railroad and survived. That evening, Governor Pitkin invited them to dinner. A celebration, he called it. Ruth Ann wore the dress properly cleaned, now the bloodstains gone. Caleb had shaved and looked almost civilized in borrowed clothes. Running Elk wore traditional Shoshone dress, his wounded arm in a sling but his bearing proud. To justice, Pitkin said, raising his glass, and to 3 people brave enough to demand it. To 40 families who trusted us, Ruth Ann corrected, we didn't do this alone. No, but you started it. You stood on that auction block and refused to stay down. That takes a special kind of courage." Pitkin set down his glass. "So, what happens now? Do you go back to Timber Ridge?" Ruth Ann looked at Caleb. They hadn't talked about after, hadn't let themselves think beyond surviving. "I don't know," she admitted. "My parents' land is in Pennsylvania, but it doesn't feel like home anymore. Home feels like—" She stopped, unsure how to finish. "Like a cabin on a mountain," Caleb said quietly, "with someone who makes the silence feel less empty." Their eyes met across the table. Ruth Ann felt her breath catch. "Then I guess I'm going back to the mountain," she said. Pitkin smiled. "I think that's wise. Let the legal process play out. Stay somewhere safe. And Miss Stoultz, if you ever decide you want to do this kind of work permanently, organizing people against corruption, I'd be happy to fund it. The territory needs advocates like you." Ruth Ann hadn't thought about the future beyond the immediate fight, but the idea sparked something in her chest. Helping others the way she'd been helped. Standing up for people who couldn't stand alone. "I'll think about it," she said. They left Denver 2 days later, escorted by federal marshals until they were clear of the city. Running Elk rode with them as far as his camp, then clasped both their arms. "You did good, both of you. My people are in your debt. We're all in each other's debt," Ruth Ann said. "That's what family does." Running Elk smiled. "Yes, family." He looked at Caleb. "My niece would be proud of you. You finally found your way back to living." "I had help," Caleb said, glancing at Ruth Ann. "The best kind." Running Elk turned his horse. "Come visit in spring. Bring your wife." He rode off before either of them could correct him. Ruth Ann and Caleb continued alone through the mountains. The journey that had been frantic and desperate on the way to Denver felt peaceful now. They took their time, stopped to rest, talked about everything and nothing. "What will you do with your parents' land?" Caleb asked on the second day. "If the courts ruled in your favor." "Sell it, probably. Use the money to buy the valley land that's in limbo. Make sure it goes to people who'll actually live on it, not the railroad." Ruth Ann looked at him. "What about your cabin? Is there room for two?" "There's room. But Ruth Ann, you need to understand what you're choosing. It's isolated up there, hard work, long winters. Not many people would choose that life." "I'm not many people. And I've learned something these past weeks. I don't need fancy things or easy living. I need purpose. I need work that matters. I need someone who sees me as a person, not a problem." She reached over and took his hand. "I need you, Caleb, if you'll have me." Caleb pulled Shadow to a stop. Ruth Ann halted Willow beside him. They sat there on the trail mountains rising around them, the future spreading out uncertain and possible. "I'm not an easy man to love," Caleb said roughly. "I'm scarred, damaged. I killed people and I'll probably have to kill again. I have nightmares. I forget how to be gentle. Ruth Ann leaned over and kissed him. It wasn't graceful. She nearly fell off her horse and Caleb had to catch her. But it was real, true, a promise made without words. When they broke apart, Caleb was smiling. Actually, smiling, the expression transforming his scarred face. "Was that a yes?" he asked. "That was a yes. Now take me home." They reached the cabin as the sun set. The structure stood intact despite Kerr's men's attempted arson. Caleb had rebuilt the damaged parts before leaving for Denver. It looked like home. Ruth Ann dismounted and just stood there taking it in. The mountains, the trees, the small garden plot that would bloom in spring. The life she'd chosen. Second thoughts, Caleb asked, coming up beside her. Not one. They spent the evening settling in, making dinner, tending the horses, falling into the rhythms they'd established before Denver. But something had shifted. They moved around each other with new awareness, new possibility. That night they lay in bed with no fur wall between them, just space they'd chosen to close. Caleb, Ruth Ann said into the darkness, "Yeah? Thank you for buying me, for seeing me, for showing me I was worth more than $1. You were always worth more. You just needed someone to prove it." He turned to face her. "Ruth Ann, I need you to know something. My wife will always be part of me, always be a hole that can't be filled. I can't promise I won't grieve her, can't promise I won't have bad days. I'm not asking you to forget her. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you while you remember, while you heal, while we build something new without erasing what came before." Ruth Ann reached across the darkness. "I loved parents I'll never see again. You loved a wife who's gone. We're both broken in ways that won't ever fully mend. But maybe we can be broken together and make something whole anyway." Caleb pulled her close. She fit against him like she'd been made for exactly this space. "I love you," he whispered. "I didn't think I'd ever say that to anyone again. But I love you, Ruth Anne Stoultz. Your strength, your stubbornness, the way you refused to stay down even when the whole world pushed you there." "I love you too," Ruth Ann whispered back. "My mountain man who couldn't watch anymore, who saved me and let me save him back." They fell asleep, tangled together, two broken people building something whole. Spring came to the valley like a promise kept. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows just like Caleb had described. The garden Ruth Ann planted flourished. News arrived that the railroad's land acquisitions had been voided. Families were getting their property back. Silas Kerr was awaiting trial on multiple charges. More news came too. Uncle Matthias had fled to California wanted for fraud. The Pennsylvania land sold for enough money to buy 3 parcels in the valley. Ruth Ann deeded them to Shoshone families who'd lost everything. Running Elk's people visited often. Morning Star taught Ruth Ann more skills. The children called her auntie and brought her flowers. A community formed around the cabin on the mountain. One morning, 6 months after Denver, Ruth Ann woke to find Caleb already up building something outside. She dressed and went to investigate. A second-room addition, carefully framed, ready for walls. "What's this?" she asked. Caleb turned, looking sheepish. "Thought we might need more space. Eventually, if you want." Ruth Ann understood what he was asking. A room for children, a future they'd build together. "I want," she said simply. He smiled and kissed her forehead. "Then we'll build it. Together." That afternoon, they rode to town for supplies. Timber Ridge had changed in the months since the trial. Sheriff Tom had been replaced by someone honest. The land office had new management. People nodded to Ruth Ann on the street instead of turning away. They were loading the wagon when a woman approached. The same woman who'd clapped at the town meeting. "Miss Stoultz, I wanted to thank you. My family got our land back because of you, because you stood up when it mattered." "I just did what anyone should do," Ruth Ann said. "No, most people wouldn't have. Most people would have signed those papers and disappeared," and the woman pressed something into Ruth Ann's hand, a small carved wooden bird. My husband made this. It's a meadowlark. Sings even in hard times. Reminded us of you." Ruth Ann clutched the carving, her throat tight. "Thank you." They rode home as the sun set, painting the mountains gold and pink. Ruth Ann looked at the valley they'd fought for, the home they'd built, the life they'd chosen. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Caleb. "One silver dollar changed everything. If you'd walked away that day, your life would be simpler." "Simpler isn't better. And no, I don't regret it. Not 1 second." He looked at her. "You changed me, Ruth Ann. Reminded me that living and surviving aren't the same thing. Showed me I could build something new without destroying what came before. That's worth more than simple." Ruth Ann thought about the girl on the auction block. Terrified, humiliated, certain she was worthless. That girl felt like a stranger now, someone she'd been briefly before becoming who she was meant to be. "I was never unwanted," she said softly. "I was just waiting for someone to see my worth. And now I see it myself, and that makes all the difference." They reached the cabin as stars emerged. Lamplight glowed through the windows they'd hung together. Smoke rose from the chimney of the home they'd built. In the garden, early vegetables pushed through the earth promising harvest. Ruth Ann dismounted and stood there taking it in. This life, this love, this hard-won peace. Caleb came up beside her, and together they walked toward the light spilling from their door. Two people who'd been broken by the world and refused to stay shattered. Two souls who'd found each other in the darkness and chosen to build something bright. Behind them, the valley stretched out in moonlight. Ahead, their home waited warm and welcoming. And in that moment, Ruth Ann knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice. Not the easy choice, not the safe choice, but the right one. She'd been sold for $1 silver and found she was worth everything. She'd stood when the world told her to kneel. She'd fought when others said surrender. She'd survived when surviving seemed impossible. And now she was home. Not in a place, but in a life she'd built with her own hands alongside someone who'd seen her worth when no one else would. The fat Amish girl nobody wanted had become Ruth Ann Brandt. Wife, fighter, advocate, survivor. And as she crossed the threshold into warmth and light and love, she knew her story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. This time, on her own terms, written in her own hand, lived on her own courage. The auction block was behind her. The mountains were her witness. And mercy had won after all.